And now, please, can we welcome to the Bar stage Rory McDowall Clark, who's going to talk about romance and modern love stories. So, Rory, thank you very much. There you are.
Monday, Valentine's Day, date in the calendar of capitalism when we're urged to pay inflated prices for flowers, chocolates, pieces of folded card, all in the name of love. So romantic love is the central narrative of high and low culture. Music, art, literature, theatre, Netflix box sets, they're all underpinned by the framework of love as the key to happiness. But here we are, key to happiness. Romantic love. Walk up into the sunset. Is this just fantasy? Is it an illusion? The academic Finn Bowring calls romantic love a synthetic emotion, a toxic fiction. Robert Graves isn't that wild about it either. Calls it a universal migraine, blotting out reason. Yeah, I've been there. Think about all those famous love stories, Romeo and Juliet, Lancelot and Guinevere, Antony and Cleopatra, Tristan and Isolde. I could go on. Not one ends happily. Love is our most complex and perplexing emotion, so something I think is worth exploring. Very unromantic people consider love through brain scans, neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, things like this. Bode and Kushnick go one further. At least they recognise the cognitive and social factors. But I still think that this is very reductive definition. It just sees it as an aspect of nature. So what's the equivalent of Valentine's Day in nature? The male bowerbird, the Andy Spector of the bower world, collects little gifts that he arranges to entice a female into his bower. It's sort of, come up and see my etchings, darling. His sense of colour leads him to, it draws him to colours that offset his plumage and complement him. For instance, this one likes red because he has a neon pink crest that he erects if a female passes by. Scientists call this costly signals. I need my water. Costly because of the time and the effort and the energy involved. My favourite is the satin bower, who's a glorious shade of blue. Think of the time and effort involved in him collecting bottle tops, clothes pegs, ice cream spoons. So much more effort than buying a Valentine card. Though he could if he chose. A lot of energy goes into these sort of rituals because selecting a mate is a very risky business. The female needs to make sure that she's supported in bringing up the young. The male just needs to be chosen. Look at me. So, is it just about sex? About selecting a mate? About getting laid? I think this confuses love with sexual desire. It sees it as just a human drive like hunger, thirst. And besides, if it was just a natural drive, then we would see it throughout history, and that's not the case. For the ancient Greeks, Eros was the god of love. although what he represented is more what we would think of as lust. The Greeks did recognize different forms of love. Plato conceived it as a ladder with higher forms such as love for fellow beings, valued more highly than mere carnal pleasure, why we talk of platonic love. But no notion of romantic love. Romantic love was an invention of the 12th century, and French, of course. It originated with the lyric poets, the troubadours of Provence and Languedoc, and their tales of idealized love and chivalry. More refined love. We call it courtly love. Concerned heroic deeds and quests that one would undertake to win the heart of a noble lady. Because courtly love, as the name suggests, only pertained to the wealthy. Nowadays, this symbol of the heart is ubiquitous, especially around Valentine's Day. This is the first known image of the heart like this, from 1344. The knight pledges his faithful heart in the service of one lady. There's some controversy about the extent to which courtly love was purely in the spiritual domain, i.e. non-physical, or how much it might have been sexual. I think that kind of misses the point, because courtly love was elevated. It existed on a higher plane to everyday life. So the troubadours spread this ideal widely, for instance, in Le Roman de la Rose. This was one of the most widely read books across, call it a book, a work, across Europe in the 14th and 15th century. The fact that this is before the printing press and most of the population was illiterate, there are over 300 copies of this still extant. Shows how popular it was. And the abandonment to the experience of love has remained a familiar plot structure ever since. But romantic love is far removed from reality. It's something felt for someone, its material existence is quite different to our own. The ugly realities of life don't intrude. It's not somebody you see cutting their toenails. Perhaps that's a secret of its intensity. Because for most of history, there was no notion of romantic love as a basis for marriage. Marriage was a largely economic arrangement. For the powerful, it was about forging dynastic alliances. But for everyone, it was a mechanism for ensuring legitimate heirs and passing on property. Few expected to feel romantic about their partners. I don't think these two do, for instance. So, whilst Restoration drama sometimes ended with marriage, the plots were much more cynical and likely to revolve around adultery. It was recognised that marriage and love are two separate things, and so adulterous romances were more or less the only romances. This is a print from Hogarth, the 18th century equivalent of box set, perhaps. Marriage à la mode. Episode 2, the Earl of Squander, bankrupt, has married the daughter of a wealthy merchant. If you're not familiar with it, there's a good wiki page, but you don't need me to tell you that it ends badly. Hogarth is attacking the hypocrisy and the loose morals of the upper class. in this commercial exchange of money for status. So at this time, there is a growth of the respectable, solid middle class, and the idea that marriage might be companionable, a joint partnership, was starting to take hold. But despite TV costume dramas, the idea that this is romantic is a fallacy. Marriage was still a transaction, and one in which men definitely had the advantage. They had rights to property and to the children. Women merely avoided, escaped impoverished spinsterhood. Because single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor. Strong argument in favour of matrimony. Jane Austen wrote to a friend of hers, all of Austen's books revolve around marriage, and this changing perspective is evident. Jane Bennet urges her sister, do anything rather than marry without affection. Note affection. You might consider it rather a mild basis for a marriage, not much of a sentiment perhaps. But for much of history, the idea one might actually like one's partner was by far, by no means a given. So to find a suitable love match, or a suitable match, couples engaged in courting. There's that courtly word again. It's a well-established protocol to get to know each other, to proceed to marriage, a fairly formal arrangement, but that doesn't preclude romance. This is when the Valentine took off, initially an individualized message of love. Like the bowerbird, it took time and effort, commercialized over time, inevitably, and the penny post did wonders for the Valentine market. Because technological change inevitably affects the progress of love. One of the most important examples is the bicycle. Prior to the mid-Victorian period, the average distance between the birthplace of a married couple was about a mile. From the 1880s, when cycling became very popular, that grew to 30 miles. My thanks to Henning Bain for that fascinating nugget. Things more relaxed into the 20th century. Women could go to dances, meet young men, with considerably more freedom. But courting was still more or less a social norm up until the end of World War II. But the 60s brought many social changes. More liberal culture, an ideology of personal freedom, of self-fulfillment. Particularly significant, the contraceptive pill meant sexual activity no longer need result in pregnancy. Sex outside marriage lost its stigma. People could engage in short-term relationships. They could even grow pampas grass in the garden. So, courtship used to lead to marriage, which would lead to sex. Now relationships are reversed, and very often they start with sex, proceed to living together, and then people may or may not marry. Because easier divorce is clearly an important part of these changes, as well as greater educational opportunities that gave women far more independence. They no longer needed a man to support them, because the romantic ideal is not kind to women. It distorts our perception. It glamorizes exciting but temperamental, Byronic, and downright flaky men. I love the irony of this title. It teaches us to be overly concerned about appearance. And above all, it reminds us that we must be rather dim. A woman's role is to admire male cleverness. Never let on that you have a brain. Because selfless devotion to a man is what gives a girl's life purpose. Romantic love is indeed a toxic fiction. Because cultural practices shape how we envisage romance, inevitably there's shifts over time in the perception of love. Rather than transcendence, we value intimacy and emotional closeness. But the legacy of romantic love remains, and people still look for romance. Technology's changed the way that we do that. Dating apps have extended the range of potential partners way beyond the 30 miles a bicycle made possible. And perhaps we need to recalibrate how we understand courtship. But there is still a lasting preoccupation with romantic love. Consider the obsession of the tabloid media with celebrity pairings and breakups. How much of modern music, any popular music, is to do with love as opposed to absolutely any other subject, whatever. Love is the most culturally determined of our emotions, yet we persist in seeing it as completely natural, a random whim of the heart. So, is love a feeling? Is it a delusion? Is it a natural drive? Or is it just a story we tell ourselves? We can't neglect the importance of fantasy and imagination in sustaining the human spirit. But perhaps in searching for love as a noun, we're liable to overlook its more important role as a verb. Random whims of the heart are perhaps timeless. So I'll leave you with Sylvius the young shepherd in As You Like It. If thou rememberest not the slightest folly that ever love did make thee run unto, thou hast not loved. Thank you.